Hi, Christian. Welcome to Network Capital. We are really excited to host you on our podcast. In this podcast, we try and deconstruct mental models and career principles. And you've had a very interesting and challenging journey thus far, inspiring and challenging both. Could you tell us a bit about what you do and how you got here? Just a high level overview, and then we're going to dive into specific aspects of each component.
Sure, and Utkarsh, thanks for having me. Um, well, if you were to open up my LinkedIn profile right now, it would have one big word on it right now. It would spell out donuts, and like literally the fried, slightly fatty pastry concoction that you love to divulge, and essentially that has been my go-to venture of the past couple of months, where I design a better kind of donut and essentially try to come up, besides the activity of making donuts, but also come up with a business, and ultimately try to scale that up. But what I've done before that was something vastly different. I don't have training in that whatsoever. Before that, I was content licensing, or basically a film buyer for Amazon Prime Video in the UK, and did that for close to 3 years. Have been with Amazon for a total of 6 years, and that is straight coming out of INSEAD. During INSEAD, I did an internship at Google. Leading up to INSEAD, I was at advertising agencies in Toronto, Canada, where I lived for 16 years. And even prior to that, I founded a couple of agencies or media production companies on my own. One of them was together with my wife at that point. And even further back, I grew up in Germany until the age of 17, until my parents, let's say, shipped me off to Canada to go there initially just to study for 2 years English and then come back. But pretty much similar to what my siblings did, never went back to Germany. And yeah, that's me in a nutshell. That's the official version.
What a fascinating journey. Like multicultural, multi-international, different sectors, and now donuts. So tell us more about donuts and Amazon, and then we're going to go sequentially back to Google and other aspects of your life.
Sure. Well, donuts started off very, I'd say, innocently, without the dire consequences that it has today, for my life, or for making a living, let's say. Where 2 years ago, I couldn't find a donut that I liked in London, so I started trying around and figure out where to find them, or like in different countries, and then starting my own recipes and iterating through some 50 recipe iterations, and 3,000 donuts later that I then fed to family and friends, and all the way to essentially late last year, when I then started trading officially at street food markets in London, and just to get that direct customer feedback, and whether this was a product slightly smaller, different taste profile, a little bit healthier, although it's still a fried food, and premium toppings ideally, and just to see whether it was received well. And that was good enough for me to say, I think I've got something here that I can work with and that I can build on, and also to actively learn in the process of setting up like a mini shop. In a sense, it's almost like you stage your own, or you play setting up your shop, and with that, then you learn so much by doing, and I use the term play, or like almost staging it on purpose, because in a sense it's been a bit of a refuge for me to start something, or to develop something that was so vastly different than what I did before. And I mean, mind you, I said I started this 2 years ago. At that point, it was a slightly different perspective that I had until.
Tell us about that perspective. How has the perspective changed in the past 2 years? When did you leave Amazon, and how easy or difficult Was it to leave a prestigious, high-paying job to move into a sector that's uncharted by a top MBA?
Um, well, essentially, I've over the past, let's say, year and a half, I faced some personal and some professional challenges where things in my life started to reorient themselves in ways that didn't align with the framework that I was used to in terms of and when I say framework, what are the things that define for you, or the principles that define for you what's right and wrong, the things that you determine are worthwhile going after, the things that you deem or define as successful, obviously very much informed by the context or the environment that you live in, the people that you have around you. So a few things happened, let's say, to me that that led me to make a decision that I need to make some drastic changes in my life. And I use the term "happened to me" because very often that's the perception that people make certain decisions, or you're being exposed to certain behavior, or you witness something where you say, why is this being done to me? But ultimately, it's a two-way street. In the same way, let me put it this way. It is so absolutely crucial that at some point you recognize, regardless of what happens around you or what you interact with, that you need to take responsibility for your own, that you need to be accountable. And at that point, I made the decision that I just needed to do a completely 180 and just go, or at least go in a very, very different direction.
So this is a time when you're reorienting your mental models, thought processes at a time where you're going through, as you mentioned, or were going through personal and professional challenges. What were some tips and tricks that helped you deal with your mental health better, or take care of yourself, for the lack of better words?
You need to, as always in life, you need to orient yourself around something, or you need to go for something. And another way of putting that is there is, like, you need to see, or you need to find a certain purpose in your life. And when I say purpose, I don't mean as in, here's used solving world hunger, or here's this big problem that I'm solving. But even, like, think even more minuscule, even smaller. Like, you will get up and you will have, let's say, a structured or disciplined process to your life, or even to your morning, when you're focused on something, when you believe there's a purpose for me to get up. And without that, you're going to float. So the moment you feel you are floating, you feel that I'm not entirely sure how I'm calibrated, what's important to me right now, what should I be going after. At that stage, like, I think you need to actually distance yourself from whatever you're facing right then and then, and you need to get clarity around this, where you are at that point, and what are the various venues that you could travel in, or the paths that you could take to essentially to focus on a particular target or objective or purpose, as I said earlier. Just picking up on, because I don't feel like I answered that question earlier, in terms of what did you say, top-notch MBA? I think you were talking about me. So top MBA students coming from a prestigious company like Amazon and now doing Doughnuts. I mean, that was very much by design, and that's where the meaning of this, let's call it this venture or this undertaking that I'm a part of now, of building a donut company, was so important, and also changed its meaning for me, that I wanted to move away from essentially what I knew, what I thought I was comfortable with, to do something vastly different and to be challenged and to be uncomfortable in a different way, and also not necessarily adhere to the same preconceived notions, or let's call them conventions, that are kind of tied to, you got to be in one of the FANG companies, sexy job, sexy profession, sexy company. Like you kind of adhere and go after all of these definitions of success or milestones in terms of have you made it, until you realize this isn't necessarily healthy for me, what I'm doing right now. And so Doughnuts gave me a vastly different focus, and opportunity to get my hands dirty and be challenged in a way that I hadn't been challenged before. But to go back to your question just now, understand where you are, and yes, how you got there and where you've come from is a part of that, but it shouldn't be it shouldn't be anything that holds you back. So understand where you are, and then find ways to orient or reorient yourself to be able to go after something different that you deem worthwhile at that point.
No, absolutely. Running after external validations is a short way to have a miserable life. More college and business school programs need to focus on that. But, let's flip this question and explore the market. When you decided to start something in Doughnuts and essentially transformed your passion into a job, it's also a huge market, or is it? Or do you feel it's a competitive market? How did your MBA brain tell you to sort of map out this business? Or is it a business, or is it still a passion project?
It's depends on what day you ask me. But let's say it should be a business. It's something that should be taken seriously and should be treated like something worthwhile, and for that matter, a business. And when we talk about business, or when I use the term business, I actually make a differentiation between the activity of making donuts and the passion, as you mentioned as well, that kind of drives that, let's say on a day-to-day basis, and discovering new flavors and new ways to improve certain aspects of the whole food experience. And then there's the business itself, where you say, okay, let's assume we have a product that people actually like and where the margins are there. And now how do we build a brand story, a narrative around that? How do we scale it up? What are the challenges with moving this from a one man or like a mom and pop shop type activity to a business that where other individuals could be employed, where it serves as as people kind of delve into let's say the founder story, etc., and how that company hopefully will have ultimately grown, to find that as a source of inspiration, and also understand that the growing pains associated with a small business, and how to raise that up properly. It doesn't actually matter whether you do donuts or it's like a vastly different or other product. I mean, I recall quite vividly, even just a few weeks or months back, just thinking of, my goodness, how do I get a food safety rating in the small kitchen that I'm using for this purpose right now? How do I wrap my head around the various employee liability and public liability and insurance? How do I approach the market? It's a bit of a chicken and the egg, as in I think I need to start at a market to get to a better market. But if I'm not at a market already, so how do I get my foot in the door? So it's a lot of persistence that went into that. A lot of just blasting it out in terms of, you just email everybody, you just call up the local authority as far as the food safety rating is concerned. You have conversations with them, all of these knowledge gaps. You just keep on going after the individuals, or let's say the parties that you think would know best or better, and very often it's also people who've done this before. Um, so
And I would
that's
imagine, like, in addition to so much of labor, it's also capital involved. So how did you think through the capital requirements? Because now I understand you also have a physical location in London. Where are you right now in terms of scale of operations? Where do you wish to take it? And
that's that sounds so big, scale of operations. So yes, a physical location as far as it's like a street food pop-up is concerned. So where I would trade, and I would find like a helper, like either a friend who's food safety trained, or even some of the folks who work in this, or veterans who work in this community, where I'd set up shop for, let's say, 1 or 2 days at a time at a local street food market. So most recently, and coming up next week, for example, I'm going to be at Brick Lane or Truman Brewery's upmarket. That's smack in the middle of the city. Whereas in December, for a couple of weekends, I was at a like a proper street food market, like out on the street, at like 5 degrees Celsius. Like it felt like a little bit in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't matter though. What that helped me initially was to just get a really good grip and understanding of the simple process of setting up a stall and doing like an on-site production of the product, how to serve it, how to communicate with customers, etc. So I don't have necessarily a physical shop yet. I think that's something that will probably come. Let's give it 2 to 3 months, where I would then say, I'm going to do a pop-up shop, like a short-term lease for 4 to 6 weeks, and then also delve a little bit into a more diversified offering. And with that, or the purpose of that is also to differentiate yourself from all the other players that are in the market. I mean, this goes back to what you touched on earlier in terms of, is there a market? There definitely is a market, as long as you do something slightly different, and maybe read a little bit the trends that are on the street in terms of more conscious choices around consumption of any type of food, healthier choices, let's say better ingredients. I mentioned earlier, like a smaller form factor, for example, where it doesn't feel like a huge commitment every time you hold like a donut in your hand that's somewhere like 3 to 4 inches, so 9 to 12 centimeters in diameter, and you're like, should I have a real meal or should I have a donut? Like give customers choices around that, and I think that's also something that I then picked up from let's say my previous life. Like Amazon is certainly one, if not the most customer obsessed company, as it hails itself to be as well, in the world. And there's just, I mean, what that taught me is to always kind of revert back to a question around, would this be in the interest of the customer? Would this be what purpose would this serve if I have a certain product being offered in that particular way? Is there a problem that I'm solving? So yeah.
And I think there's a lot of novelty in the story as well. So I think as you try and change the way donut is consumed in London, I feel that the underlying story of it is a huge selling factor as well. I'm sure you've been to the Seattle farmers market, where they do this whole song and dance about the way they ship, like where the fish is exchanged hands. And I think the whole joy of it is just watching it in action. Same for donuts. I mean, I've seen it once being actually made somewhere near Cambridge. And I remember that moment quite fondly. So I think this is absolutely true, in addition to what you said. I mean, the way you consume, reimagining that could be an important process.
That, I mean, you touched on the spectacle of, a fish being thrown from one end of the the hall to the other kind of, or you're like, it's like flying fish past your head kind of thing. And I mean, even the fact that you just mentioned it, which means it was memorable. I mean, that's certainly one aspect. But as you started that statement or that questionnaire, in terms of building or developing a different product, I mean, we especially coming out of MBA school, we're kind of being drilled or conditioned to come up with something or to develop something that is, I'm gonna call it super new, something that hasn't been there before. Ideally, that's digital. Very often, I mean, that goes now in the direction of fintech. And on the other hand, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, in looking at well-established products where you'd say, I realize this has been like this for, I don't know how many years. I don't know how long the donut has been around at this point, mind you, but I think it dates back to like early 20th or even 19th century. But where you could say this isn't a 21st century type of invention here. This is an extremely simple, almost like what you associate with a donut is almost like this is what your kids eat, right? So almost like a childish product, but there is room to actually to get kind of go deep on and say, I'm going to do something very different here. And if I do it right and I put certain milestones or even checks in place where I'd say, is this going in the right direction? I think there's so much that you can do with products that seem almost naive, I want to say, because that's what it is. Like it's just a stupid little donut, but there's like I found a way to just wrap my head around it in terms of like pretty much everything, just taking the whole thing apart and putting it back together. And it doesn't, like, you don't always need to flock towards like this definition of sexy, of hasn't been there before. Like, there's a lot of room for improvement with a ton of things that we already have in our lives.
Oh, absolutely. You can reimagine the product, the process, the business model, the experience. A lot of it is open to disruption. You just need to see it differently.
Let me actually add to that. And as far as this particular, like this example, because I mean, this is just my thing. It doesn't mean that donut is going to save the world. But just as far as this example is concerned, like when we talk about a donut, everybody knows what a donut is. You don't have to explain it to anybody. Where the explaining happens, and mind you, that's also one of the lessons that I have been learning, and that's still going on, is the more you change, I mean, that's when you start having to explain it to people. And because even today, like, there's still some folks who come by, let's call it the shop, and like, what is this? I'm like, okay, the giant sign says donuts. The price board says donuts. It says donuts on the description right next to the donuts, and you're still asking me what it is. So, that's where I have to be careful that I don't change too many things at once and all of a sudden call it something different, for example. But it is so awesome that when I talk to anybody about this is what I'm doing right now, that they pretty much know, at least have a good fundamental understanding of what it is that I'm talking about. And then all of a sudden you can engage in a conversation around, here's how I'm doing it differently and better, and and here's the opportunity.
You can literally explain your product without using any buzzwords, product, service, and company, which is a huge advantage in a way, if you look at it that way.
Definitely, yeah. There's no synergy in this company yet.
Tell me, when you applied for an MBA, what kind of career had you imagined for yourself, and how much of your future projection turned out to be true, and how much did it change? Now that you're out 5, 6 years, in what ways has your life been different than you imagined, and what way is it the same?
There are probably two parts to this answer. Number one, it's okay. First of all, it's totally different from what I expected. Like that's the headline for the first part. The headline for the second part is I had no clue really. I knew why I wanted to go to business school because I believed that if I found a way to be more structured around the let's call it my creative juices or my creativity, that I should be better at monetizing that, capitalizing that, making a living out of it. What that assumes, though, even the way I just phrased that, is that I didn't necessarily had confidence in my abilities going into school. So getting an MBA was my attempt to be more structured around how I would apply my skills or talent or whatever you want to call it at that point, like the things that I was heavily focused on and engaged in up to that point. But leading up to it, and mind you, I still have that today in mind you in a different way. Like for me, going to business school was extremely daunting. Like where I'd all of a sudden have to get into accounting and finance, and even up to that point, I'd be like, I can barely balance my own checking or bank account. So now I'm going to be exposed to all of this stuff, and it's highly quantitative, and like this is I feel like I'm signing my creativity away here, and all of a sudden come out of as a vastly different person than what I thought I'd be. So it's kind of, and even like I feel like I just contradicted myself, because as in I went in with one hope, but ultimately had a different fear. But
you did really well, right? You got an internship in Google, a great job at Amazon. In what ways did you surprise yourself?
Well, one big surprise was that I didn't lose myself during the experience, meaning that although engaging in courses or like focusing at least academically on coursework that was so just vastly, let's call it, out of my league, there were still opportunities for me to apply my creativity, and also actually through that connect with the community there, where I think people came to understand who I was, what I stood for, what I was interested in, what I was passionate about, etc. And that was a surprise that kind of halfway through it, and I mean, you may know this, like the INSEAD Cabaret, which is the self-organized theatrical event at some point during the school year. I mean, there are people obviously have to organize it, and I all of a sudden found myself organizing this event together with a few other people who were extremely patient with me at that point. And actually, at the end of the night, I remember distinctly that, and I looked back and said, "Wow, I thought I would now shed a part of me in this during this year at business school, but ultimately I feel I'm more myself than I've ever been." And with the benefit of the structure that this education was to give you, or to some extent even impose on you. I think that was probably the biggest
That is
surprise.
a profound thought. I mean, you retain the core elements of yourself and still augment it by different facets. What was, in addition to the academic component of it, what was the most memorable part of your business school experience, and what challenged you the most?
Um, Memorable part and what challenged me the most. Um, well, the memorable part is certainly as in what sticks and what you kind of go back to are the people,
Yeah.
the connections you forged, and that doesn't mean it wasn't always a party, but also the fact that you lived through what is it like a high pressure environment and a very challenging year because it's so short. Not necessarily because it's academically so challenging. It's just you have a ton of stuff crammed into a fairly short period of time, and to live through that with individuals who have equally committed themselves to living through that and let's call it create value along the way, meaning you work with each other, you want to achieve good/great results. You also want to get to know the people around you, and through that have an overall extremely enriching experience. So it's certainly the people and the memories associated with those people that sticks. And then the second part was most challenging aspect, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's
I felt
like
you
what
answered that to some extent because prioritizing so much is scheduled in such a short period of time that when you do something, you have to let go of the other. But
well,
if there's any advice that you have for prospective B school applicants, what might that be? What should they be careful of?
well, there are certain, and I think that might actually segue into as in what's the big takeaway from business school. Maybe is there like one of the big lesson learned, not just for me but also for a lot of people around me, was what are the things you say no to? What are the doors that you are willing to close, and how do you determine that? I mean, we generally live in an age of FOMO. Like I even see this actually at the food market where you have like 30 different offerings, and you walk through there, and I have that for myself, and you end up not buying or eating anything because you're like, if I eat this, then I can't eat any of the other stuff. And in the same way, you go to school or you commit yourself to this experience, and at that point you're like, there are only so many things that you can do, and there are actually even aside from what you are able to do or capacity wise that you can squeeze in, there are even fewer things that are actually healthy for you. Healthy for you meaning they don't drain you, they don't take anything away from you, but they ideally leave you with something at the end where you say, I'm glad I did this, which doesn't mean it has to be academic, but it can also be just like being with people or just kind of like a fun aspect. So to be more specific, to answer your question, I think the biggest challenge was, how do you prioritize? How do you allocate your time, your resources, your energy, your attention in a way that you walk out of a room or out of a session or out of a year richer than before? And what are the things that you say no to? And very often, these would be defined by your context, as in the external world, by what you think is expected of you. And I think the moment you're being put in a high pressure situation, you come to very quickly realize what is actually important to you. And very similar, like I lived in the past year and a bit, what are the choices that I need to make in order to be healthy and come out of this as a bit more of a human being than I was before?
How is your day different from the day you started, say, working at Amazon to today? Say, first day one at Amazon and day one at your full-fledged commitment to the donut company.
Today I love getting up because I not because I didn't like my job at Amazon. I love my job at Amazon. Mind you, I had 3 different roles during my 6 years at Amazon.
Could you just tell us what those roles were and what briefly, and then move to this answering this question?
Sure. So coming actually straight out of biz school, a month and a half later, started at Amazon as the sexy title is head of marketing for a retail category, which is essentially the PC category, so selling computers and peripherals, etc. The official title was senior site merchandiser. Did that for a year and a half. And it was essentially the customer facing campaigns that I would oversee, and at that point also coming up with a seasonal gift guides. And because I mean, if there's one thing that Amazon might not be great at, is you finding stuff while casually browsing it. I mean, it's awesome in terms of its product offering if you know what you're looking for. But if you go there, it's like, I need to buy a printer. I don't necessarily know what printer to buy, or any product for that matter. You're not necessarily going to get expert advice on Amazon. And I think that's where brick and mortar still really kicks ass
Right.
in most cases. But so did that for a year and a half, and then moved to what's called the Amazon Marketplace team, predominantly looking after Chinese sellers selling into Europe and everything that's associated with that, such as how fast or how can you accelerate shipping, can you decrease shipping costs, product quality, product safety, customer service, counterfeit issues, compliance issues. Like in the UK, for example, you're only allowed to sell an electrical device with a 3-prong plug. But the moment something comes from somewhere else, even somewhere else in Europe, and it only has a 2-pin plug, it's deemed illegal. And like there's a ton of stuff that you can wrap your head around where you say, okay, between a customer not knowing where this product comes from and it arrives as if it was somewhere coming out of a fulfillment center, 10 miles from here, as opposed to this coming from halfway around the world, what are the challenges that we need to tackle? So did that for 8 months, and at that point, actually my boss left the business, and I didn't feel like remotely reporting into somebody because I had done this in my previous role for a number of months as well. And in that regard, Amazon is awesome because there's this major flexibility around you moving around within the company into different roles, and something opened up in Prime Video. And for me, there was an opportunity to get back into a creative business. And at that stage, in May 2016, I became the lead licenser or buyer for film, so for movies in the UK. Again, very different from what I had done before, but it was just and again, like another instant where you could say I kissed the floor that I walked on, because it was just such an awesome activity. The difference between getting up today versus getting up at that point was that like today it all comes down to me, and that's a blessing and a curse. A blessing in a sense of, this is like you can be, this is all you, and nobody's telling you what to do, and there's a path of discovery associated with that. There's you doing things in a new and different way, and you can do it at your own pace, etc. And that's not necessarily always a good thing, but it's also occurs because the momentum starts and ends with you, as opposed to being embedded in a corporate environment where you can tap into other people pulling you along. If you run your own company, essentially, if you have let's say an off day where you're like, I'm not feeling it, well, everything stops. So you almost need to psych yourself up at times artificially to really to push hard and keep going. But ultimately, every little success And mind you, that's another reason why I, let's say, chose Doughnuts or a direct-to-consumer product. Like every little success, like knowing that you made something today that wasn't there yesterday or even a few hours ago, or you look at your daily reports in terms of your turnover, etc. Like it's so very gratifying and rewarding to have these small successes along the way, which is also what gets you up the next day then, as opposed to you contributing something significant but ultimately very, very small and tiny to a very large like moving vessel, which the question is, would they really notice if you weren't around, right?
Yeah. And this is such a helpful analysis, because you are somebody who did so well in the corporate career. But yeah, these are very different paths. I think once you've tasted freedom and the joy of creation, it's very difficult to find joy in some of the other procedural tasks and other strategic tasks even.
Utkar, I'm not sure I did well, to be honest. And that's why. So when we started this conversation, I said, if you check my LinkedIn profiles, and here would be kind of the narrative, and it looks promising. But I think that's where this becomes important for your listeners as well. If I look back and say, how did I perform? How did I do? Was I successful? There are many instances where I'd say I could have done something differently. I could have done better. And what plays into that as well then, although as an absolute term or definition of here's my job, let's say working in the film industry, which is like the ultimate conversation starter anywhere you go. But then you still look around and you compare yourself to other people, as in, how did I do? How much money am I making? Am I moving the needle? Is what I'm doing important? So those questions actually don't go away. And at the same time, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. Like if I look at my past, there's so much to be grateful for. There are so many opportunities where people actually reached out to me, remembering me from earlier conversations or from us working together and saying, hey, here's this opportunity. I think you'd be great for it. I'm not negating any of that, but I'm certainly not, even with that mindset of, count your blessings and look back at where you've come from and everything that you were privileged and blessed to do. There isn't necessarily a feeling of, for the stage that I am in my life, I've made it. That's a pipe dream.
Oh, hats off for such a growth mindset. But I'll still stick to the point that you did really well. You may not have been perfect, but I think perfection is not something one should strive for, because then one stops growing. No?
Well, you can strive for perfection. Just realize that you don't. You won't necessarily get there. The same way as in, I'm trying to make the perfect donut. Have I arrived at that point? No. I think I've found ways to improve the product, but I haven't arrived. I think you need to enjoy the striving part, though. So the process. You need to be. You need to understand, and at that point commit to what it is that you're doing on a daily basis, let's say, to get you closer to that ideal, as opposed to and even actually, as I used that word, I was thinking of another word, like an idol. If you turn that ideal into an idol, that actually means you don't care about the process anymore, but you're going after this super definition of a thing, and if you don't get there, it's super disappointing. And so the striving part, I think, is super important. Striving for perfection, as long as you know what that is, and knowing that it's abstract. But yeah, I think that's fine. But the moment you get lost and you're like, actually, I don't like what I'm doing, I just want to have the payoff, which also means you're looking for shortcuts, and which also means you may be all of a sudden willing to compromise on certain ethics or principles, or just to get there faster. And I'm not saying that that's the case, but as in all of a sudden, if you're just going for the goalpost, but you don't actually invest or commit to the process of getting there, that becomes a very tedious undertaking.
In the past 5, 6, 7 years, I'm sure that this path of trying to, find yourself, make an impact, would have led to lots of highs and lots of lows. Who have been some of your mentors or thought partners, and how have they helped you develop or shape your vision?
That, like, if you asked me that question a year ago as opposed to today, or even in a year from now, I'd probably give you a different answer every single time. Like, I'm somebody who gets, and I'm obviously, in part based on me talking about creativity and getting excited about a donut, and like, you can probably tell that I get excited by certain things quite easily. In the same way, I also look for people who have excelled at certain things. So it's super difficult for me to give you a list of names, because there wouldn't be anybody on there where I'd say, this person really is perfect. And maybe
that's not
your question.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Point well taken.
I think there are, gosh, I could go down the cliche route, like, there's Steve Jobs, and there's an Elon Musk, there's a Peter Thiel, and all of them are somehow, technology, again, back to sexy land. But I think what I appreciate about these people and a lot of other people, I'm also talking about, I forgot his first name, Freeman, the guy who founded Blue Bottle in the US. It's like this uber expensive coffee, but it's
that was just bought by Nescafe for $1 billion.
Yeah. It's just there's a commitment to the process, and there is a vision around coming up with something that's better. And I'd say more or less for all of them, if you read some of their, and actually, mind you, that's also the case for Jeff Bezos, certainly is. If you read their story, there were many instances where they had to acknowledge that they were wrong, and then I think it's the decisions you make at that point, as in, okay, we need to pivot here, and I need to reorient myself. / we haven't achieved what we wanted to achieve, or I haven't achieved what I wanted to achieve. Which could be a definition of failure at that point. And how do you then grow out of this? And how do you emerge out of this? How do you weather adversity or the challenges in your life? And I mean, all of these individuals are fairly extreme in what they've accomplished. At the same time, I certainly don't know all the skeletons in their closets, but
but they have identical parts, sure.
But I really appreciate the commitment to, or the commitment that they've shown, and in the same way, I mean, or somebody else I can think of in the same vein is I think a gentleman by the name of John Wood, who's ex-Microsoft, who started a charity I want to say 10 or 15 years ago. It all started with him delivering books to libraries or to schools in the developing world, because that's what they needed most, was access to knowledge. And he committed his life to that charity. And you could argue, well, great, coming out of a very privileged, or let's say resource rich or resource endowed starting point. And mind you, in all fairness, it's not much different from me coming out of the track that I was on with the various companies that I worked at, to now do something that's vastly different, but with that, show the commitment that it takes to make that happen and to make it something worthwhile. On that note, in terms of starting out of a privileged corner, let's say, or starting point, earlier you asked, financially heavy investment to start a new venture. I mean, that was one of the reasons, and I just want to touch on that. One of the reasons why I said, okay, I can do this donut thing, and I'll start it off as a street food business, because you don't need to rent, you don't need to have a 5-year lease and buy 50,000 pounds or dollars worth of equipment to essentially get into let's call it a proof of concept phase with what is ultimately a very simple product. I mean, my investment in this company at this point, aside from the time that I've invested in, still is probably somewhere in the 4 digits. And it is something that is already keeping me busy for most of my week. But bit by bit, and I've structured it in that way on purpose. I told myself, if I hit a certain milestone where I believe this is still worth pursuing, I'm going to invest a little more into it, and I'm going to take a little bit more risk. So you don't have to, put it all in one basket and say, what, I mean, at least not for this particular business or this idea, but there are ways to go in quite carefully and to accommodate this fairly risk-averse perspective until you say, what, now I've got a story here where I can go big, or maybe even at some point say, I'm going to approach the investor community because I believe this is a business that's going to be worth $100 million in 5 or 10 years from now. But to get there, you need to have a credible story or a credible narrative. That doesn't mean you need to spend tons and tons and tons of cash.
One of my mentors once told me that you should think big and act small. So I think that sort of applies to where you started. It's a small scale operation with a huge potential.
Yeah. And even that took me a while to get there. And again, to differentiate between here's the activity of running a donut shop versus here's me building a donut business. And it's a little bit, applying a bottoms up approach, which basically would be, how many donuts do I need to sell in order to make a living? And how do I then set up shop and all that, versus a top down approach where you'd say, okay, if this was a $100 million business in, say, again, 5 to 10 years from now, and we assume there are X number of locations, and we know what the numbers behind it are in terms of profit margins, in terms of fixed costs, and it's just capital expenditures, etc. What would this look like, and is this a realistic scenario? And the moment I adopted that approach, at least for a part-time of my of taking the time just to think through the business and creating a vision and a narrative and ultimately a business plan with that, that's when it became a little bit more of a holistic story for me. So I totally agree with you in terms of think big, act small, act small also, as in, you come out of a humble beginning, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a big appetite to create something big.
Absolutely. Christian, we're coming towards the close of the podcast. Any final piece of advice for young professionals thinking about business school or their careers at large? You've already shared such important principles. I was wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's certainly for let's say the audience that you just touched on, but also I don't think that counts for anybody. I mean, at this point, I am in my early 40s, and this is what I'm sharing. What I'm about to share will be as fresh for those folks as for young people. As in, I think number one is, who are you? Do you know who you are? And I think that's super important, not just as in don't believe everything that you think, but actually watch yourself or monitor yourself in terms of your thoughts and where those come from, what is prompting them. But more importantly, if you don't have a clear understanding necessarily of who you are, why is it you believe that somebody else will know you better than yourself? Which means we very often look to other people to have the answers, to guide us, to direct us, and almost idolize them to the extent that we expect them to be absolutely fault-free. But at the same time, we completely ignore the fact that they don't live our lives. You have not lived your life before. So it's okay that you don't have all the answers. It's okay that you actually fail in many aspects, as long as you draw a conclusion or a takeaway from that, and you let it help you build you up. And at the same time, don't look to other people to have all the answers or to not screw up. Because the moment they screw up and you put them on this pedestal, you can rest assured that house of cards of yours will come crashing down. So look to other people for guidance and for advice, but don't expect other people to make decisions for you. And in the same way, don't be too hard on yourself if you don't have all the answers. And as far as those folks aspiring to go to business school is concerned, don't expect business school to teach you or to give you all the answers either. I think I can't speak for you, but I'm just gonna make that assumption. I don't think we came out of business school having all the answers or having a huge a wealth of knowledge that we didn't have before. I think what business school taught us was to be more critical and to ask better questions and to really take the time and take in the context of a given scenario, and with that then to be better at discovering what the answer to an important question may be.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure learning from you and catching up after a while. This podcast will go out to about 100,000 people around the world, and I'm sure they'll benefit a ton. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Utkarsh. Take care.